The wind howled through the twisted branches of the old oak trees that lined the narrow road leading to the LaLaurie Mansion. A cold shiver ran down Agent Marcus O'Neill's spine as he stared at the towering structure. The mansion loomed before him like a dark sentinel, its broken windows like empty eyes staring into the soul of anyone foolish enough to approach. O'Neill had been on countless paranormal investigations, but something about this place felt different, wrong, even. His instincts, honed by years of dealing with the unknown, were screaming at him to turn back, but the mission left him no choice. The government had been monitoring the LaLaurie Mansion ever since the first team vanished without a trace. The official story was that they had all perished in a tragic accident, but O'Neill knew better. The mansion was alive with something far more malevolent than anyone could comprehend. As the team unloaded their equipment, O'Neill caught a glimpse of movement in one of the upper windows. A fleeting shadow, barely discernible, but enough to set his nerves on edge. "Did you see that?" whispered Agent Sophie Mercer, her voice trembling as she clutched her thermal camera. She was the team's newest member, young and eager, but O'Neill could see the fear in her eyes. He nodded, but said nothing, not wanting to stoke the growing tension among the team. Inside, the mansion was a tomb of silence, broken only by the creaking of the old wooden floors beneath their boots. Dust hung in the air, thick and oppressive, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. The walls were lined with faded portraits of the LaLaurie family, their eyes seeming to follow the team as they moved deeper into the house. As they set up their base of operations in the grand ballroom, O'Neill noticed that the air had grown heavy, thick with a sense of foreboding. The temperature dropped sharply, and the lights began to flicker, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Then, without warning, the ballroom doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, sending a wave of panic through the team. "Everyone stay calm," O'Neill ordered, though his own voice betrayed the fear gnawing at his gut. He reached for his radio to contact the outside team, but all he got was static. The mansion had cut them off from the world, trapping them in its malevolent grip. A low, guttural whisper echoed through the room, chilling them to the bone. It was unintelligible, but its intent was clear. It was a warning, a threat. As the team scrambled to set up their equipment, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it became a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. It felt like they were surrounded, invisible hands clawing at their minds. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Agent Mercer's frantic breathing. O'Neill felt a cold sweat trickling down his back as he glanced around the room, his heart pounding in his chest. They were not alone in this house, and whatever was with them, it was just getting started. The first night in the LaLaurie Mansion was a descent into madness. The team had barely begun their investigation when the shadows came alive. O'Neill and the others watched in horror as darkness pooled in the corners of the room, twisting and writhing like a living entity. Shapes moved within the shadows, figures that seemed to shift and change with every blink, their forms too distorted to be fully human. "Is this some kind of hallucination?" Agent Zachary Cole muttered, his voice trembling as he backed away from the encroaching darkness. He was the team's skeptic, always quick to dismiss the supernatural, but now his bravado was fading fast. "No, this is real," O'Neill replied, his voice tight with fear. He pulled out a thermal camera, hoping to catch something, anything, that would explain what they were seeing. The screen lit up with a sea of cold blue, but in the center of the room, a figure stood out. A tall, thin man, his features indistinguishable, his body a mass of swirling shadows. "It's the Shadow Man," Mercer whispered, her voice barely audible over the static from the malfunctioning equipment. "The locals say he's the guardian of this place, the one who controls the spirits. He's here to make sure we don't leave." As the Shadow Man moved closer, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost formed on the windows, and their breath came out in visible puffs of mist. The figure's presence was oppressive, like a weight pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the air itself had turned to ice, freezing them in place. "Don't let him touch you," O'Neill warned, instinctively stepping back. He had encountered malevolent entities before, but nothing like this. The Shadow Man's energy was pure malevolence, a force of darkness that seemed to feed off their fear. The team tried to retreat, but the Shadow Man was faster. He moved with unnatural speed, his form dissolving into a black mist that surged forward like a wave. O'Neill barely had time to react before the mist enveloped Mercer, lifting her off the ground and pinning her against the wall. Her screams filled the room, echoing through the mansion as the mist tightened its grip, squeezing the life out of her. O'Neill and Cole rushed to help, but as they reached out to pull Mercer free, the mist recoiled, flinging them back with a force that knocked the wind out of them. The Shadow Man's face emerged from the darkness, its features contorted into a grotesque, leering grin. It was a mockery of a human face, more like a mask than flesh, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into their souls. With a final, agonizing scream, Mercer's body went limp, and the mist released her. She crumpled to the floor, her skin pale and cold, her eyes wide open in terror. The Shadow Man lingered for a moment, as if savoring its victory, before retreating back into the shadows, leaving the team in stunned silence. O'Neill stared at Mercer's lifeless body, his mind reeling with the horror of what had just happened. They were in over their heads, trapped in a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The Shadow Man was toying with them, picking them off one by one, and it was only the beginning. The second day dawned with a sickly light filtering through the mansion's grimy windows, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. O'Neill's team was down to 3 members now, their morale shattered by Mercer's brutal death. Her body lay cold and untouched in the corner of the room, too terrifying to move, a grim reminder of the Shadow Man's power. "We need to find a way out," Cole said, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. He was pacing the room, his eyes darting to every shadow, as if expecting the Shadow Man to reappear at any moment. "There has to be another exit. We can't stay here." O'Neill nodded, though he knew that escape was easier said than done. The mansion had an unnatural layout, with hallways that twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. Rooms seemed to shift and change position when they weren't looking, trapping them in a maze of endless corridors and dead ends. "We'll split up and search for an exit," O'Neill decided, though he hated the idea of dividing their already diminished group. But time was running out, and staying put would only give the entity more opportunities to pick them off. "Keep your radios on. If you find anything, call it in immediately." The team reluctantly agreed, and they ventured into the mansion's depths. O'Neill took the north wing, a long, narrow corridor lined with ancient portraits and dusty tapestries. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and every creak of the floorboards sent shivers down his spine. He kept his flashlight trained on the shadows, expecting the Shadow Man to strike at any moment. As he moved deeper into the corridor, O'Neill felt a growing sense of unease. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking him further from the safety of the others. The walls began to close in, the space narrowing until he could barely squeeze through. His flashlight flickered, and the darkness closed in around him, oppressive and suffocating. O'Neill's radio crackled to life, and Cole's panicked voice came through. "O'Neill, I found something. A door at the end of the west wing. It's..." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. O'Neill's heart raced as he tried to respond, but the radio was dead. He had no choice but to continue forward, though every instinct screamed at him to turn back. The corridor seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the walls alive with the whispers of the dead. Shadows flitted at the edge of his vision, and he could feel something watching him, its gaze burning into the back of his skull. Finally, O'Neill reached the end of the corridor, where a heavy wooden door stood ajar. It led into a small, dimly lit room that reeked of rot. Inside, he found Cole standing motionless, his back to the door, staring at something on the floor. "Cole!" O'Neill called out, his voice trembling as he approached.
"But..."
The small room was thick with a stench so foul that it made O'Neill gag. The air was heavy, almost tangible, and as he stepped inside, it felt like he was walking into a different world, a place where the laws of nature had been twisted into something monstrous. Cole remained still, his back to O'Neill, unmoving, staring down at the floor. "Cole!" O'Neill repeated, inching closer. But Cole did not respond. O'Neill's flashlight beam cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing a disturbing sight. On the floor in front of Cole was a large mirror, shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. The shards reflected distorted images of the room, warping reality into something grotesque. But that wasn't what held Cole's attention. It was what was beneath the mirror. A body. Mercer's body. But this time, her eyes were closed, and her face was frozen in a twisted expression of terror, as if she had witnessed something unspeakable in her final moments. The blood had dried around her, and her limbs were contorted in unnatural angles, like a puppet whose strings had been severed. "Cole, we have to go," O'Neill urged, his voice shaking. But Cole didn't move. Slowly, O'Neill reached out to touch his shoulder, but as soon as his fingers made contact, Cole's body jerked violently. He turned around with a sickening snap, his head twisted at an impossible angle. His eyes were wide open, but they were not his. They were hollow black and filled with an unfathomable void. The radio at O'Neill's belt crackled to life, but the voice that came through wasn't one he recognized. It was a low, rasping whisper, distorted and malevolent. "He sees you. He knows you. He will take you." Cole's mouth opened in a silent scream, and then, with horrifying speed, his body began to crumble, disintegrating into a cloud of black ash. O'Neill stumbled backward, his mind unable to process what was happening. The ash swirled in the air, forming a shape, an inhuman face, grinning with jagged teeth, before it dispersed into the darkness. Panicked, O'Neill bolted from the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The corridor that had seemed endless before was now a labyrinth of twisting shadows, each turn leading him deeper into the mansion's clutches. The walls seemed to close in around him, pulsating with the rhythm of a heartbeat not his own. As he ran, O'Neill felt the unseen presence closing in on him. Whispers echoed all around, disembodied voices speaking in a language that twisted his mind, making him question his own sanity. The darkness was alive, crawling with unseen things that brushed against him, cold and clammy, leaving trails of ice on his skin. He stumbled into a room, slamming the door behind him, gasping for breath. But the moment he did, he realized his mistake. The room was a dead end, a small, windowless chamber with no exit. The walls were lined with old, cracked mirrors, each one reflecting his terrified face. And then the reflections began to move. O'Neill's reflection in the mirror was no longer his own. The images in the mirrors began to twist and distort, becoming something grotesque and unrecognizable. His face melted into a mass of writhing flesh, eyes bulging, mouth stretching into an unnatural grin that spread from ear to ear. His hands, once steady, became gnarled claws, scratching at the glass as if trying to break free from the mirror's confines. A voice, not his own, echoed from within the glass. "Welcome, Marcus. We've been waiting for you." The words were spoken in a chorus of voices, all blending into a single, unnerving tone that reverberated in his skull. O'Neill stumbled back, only to find himself surrounded by his twisted reflections, each more horrifying than the last. The walls of the room pulsed, alive with some dark energy, trapping him within this nightmare. He tried to look away, but the mirrors seemed to pull him in, forcing him to confront the monstrous versions of himself. The reflections began to move independently, stepping out of sync with his own movements. They reached out, clawing at the glass, their eyes filled with malice. Suddenly, the mirrors shattered with a deafening crash, and the shards flew towards O'Neill like a swarm of angry bees. He threw his arms up to protect himself, but the shards passed through him harmlessly, leaving only a biting cold in their wake. When he lowered his arms, the room was no longer a room. It was a void, a black abyss where time and space had no meaning. In the distance, O'Neill saw a faint light, flickering like a dying candle. He moved toward it, each step feeling like he was trudging through thick, freezing mud. The closer he got, the louder the whispers became, growing into a cacophony of voices screaming in his ears. The light revealed a massive, ornate mirror standing in the middle of the void, its surface rippling like water. O'Neill reached out to touch it, but as soon as his fingers brushed the surface, the mirror rippled violently. A hand shot out, grabbing him by the wrist with a grip like iron. It was his own hand, but it was wrong, discolored, rotting, with nails like claws. The mirror began to pull him in, the glass no longer solid, but a viscous liquid, dragging him into the cold, suffocating darkness. He struggled, but the force was too strong. As he was pulled deeper into the mirror, the darkness closed around him, filling his lungs with icy water. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was his own reflection grinning back at him, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. And then there was nothing but cold, empty darkness. O'Neill awoke to find himself lying on a cold, hard surface. The air was thick with moisture, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. He sat up, disoriented, his mind reeling from the horrors he had just witnessed. The memory of the mirror's grip on him was still vivid, but now he was somewhere else, somewhere even more terrifying. He was in a basement, the walls slick with slime and covered in grotesque symbols that seemed to writhe and squirm in the dim light. The floor was a patchwork of cracked stone and dirt, with puddles of stagnant water collecting in the corners. The air was foul, a mix of rot and decay that made him gag. In the center of the basement stood an old wooden door, its surface blackened and charred as if it had been through a fire. From behind the door, O'Neill could hear faint whispers, growing louder with each passing moment. It was the same chorus of voices from the mirror, beckoning him closer, pulling him toward the source of the darkness. O'Neill's instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere else to go. The basement was a dead end, a trap from which there was no escape. His hands trembled as he reached for the door, the wood cold and damp beneath his fingers. With a deep breath, he pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Beyond the door was a narrow, winding staircase descending into the bowels of the mansion. The steps were uneven, worn smooth by centuries of use, and the walls were lined with more of the writhing symbols. The whispers grew louder as he descended, filling his mind with dark thoughts, with images of pain, suffering, and death. At the bottom of the stairs, O'Neill found himself in a vast underground chamber. The ceiling was lost in darkness, and the walls seemed to stretch on forever, lined with countless alcoves that held the decaying remains of bodies. Dozens of them, each one twisted and deformed, their faces frozen in expressions of unimaginable agony. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, carved from black stone and stained with blood. On the altar lay a mirror, its surface cracked and dirty, but still faintly reflecting the chamber around it. As O'Neill approached, the whispers reached a fever pitch, the voices screaming in his mind, urging him to look into the mirror, to see what lay within. He hesitated, every fiber of his being telling him to turn back, to flee this place and never return. But the pull of the mirror was too strong, too compelling. Slowly, he leaned over the altar and gazed into the mirror. What he saw shattered his mind. The reflection was not of the chamber, but of something far worse, a twisted, nightmarish world where the dead walked and the living were hunted like animals. He saw himself in this world, his body broken and bleeding, pursued by shadows that whispered his name. And then the mirror cracked, and O'Neill felt a searing pain in his chest. He looked down to see a dark hand emerging from the mirror, its fingers digging into his flesh, pulling him in. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, and as the hand dragged him into the mirror, the chamber faded away. And with it, so did the last remnants of his sanity. O'Neill's senses were overwhelmed by an unnatural coldness as he was pulled into the mirror. The feeling was akin to being submerged in liquid nitrogen, freezing his bones and numbing his mind. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was contorted in an impossible position, writhing through a narrow tunnel of darkness. The passage was neither solid nor liquid, but a relentless vortex of icy void, dragging him deeper into its unfathomable depths. When the sensation finally stopped, he found himself lying on a cold, uneven surface. He struggled to his feet, disoriented. The air was dense and carried the faintest hints of sulfur and decay. He looked around and realized he was in a massive underground chamber with walls covered in writhing, grotesque tendrils that pulsed with a sickly green luminescence. The floor was slick with an oily substance that seemed to shift and writhe, as if it were alive. Every step O'Neill took was accompanied by a soft, wet squelch, and the substance clung to his boots, dragging him down with each step. The chamber was filled with the sound of distant, guttural growls and the occasional harsh screech, which seemed to emanate from every direction at once. Shadows moved along the walls, twisting into monstrous shapes that writhed and danced as if mocking him. In the center of the chamber stood a towering stone altar, covered in dark, ancient symbols that seemed to shift and morph before his eyes. Atop the altar was a grotesque figure, a sculpture of a demon with multiple eyes and fanged mouths that appeared to be snarling and whispering in a language O'Neill couldn't comprehend. As O'Neill approached the altar, he felt a sudden, intense pressure in his chest. His breathing became labored, and his vision blurred. He realized with growing horror that the shadows around him were not merely illusions. They were entities, manifestations of the terror that permeated this place. They began to coalesce, taking on forms that were disturbingly humanoid, but twisted and malformed. One of the shadows detached itself from the wall and began to crawl towards him on spindly limbs, its eyes glowing with an unnatural red light. It emitted a low, resonant growl that reverberated through O'Neill's bones. The creature moved with a nightmarish speed, and its form seemed to blur, making it almost impossible to focus on. O'Neill stumbled back, but the oily substance on the floor made it difficult to move. The creature lunged at him, and he barely managed to dodge its swipe. It slashed at the air where he had been standing, its claws leaving trails of black smoke. As O'Neill backed away, he noticed a door partially hidden in the shadows. Summoning the last of his strength, he ran toward it, pushing against the sludge that seemed to claw at his legs. The creature's growls grew louder, more urgent, as if enraged by his attempt to escape. With a final desperate effort, O'Neill reached the door and threw it open. The creature's roar was cut off by the sound of the door slamming shut. He collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, as the oppressive darkness of the chamber was left behind. But he knew the nightmare was far from over. The door led to a narrow, dimly lit corridor. O'Neill's breath came in ragged gasps, and he could feel his heart pounding against his ribcage like a trapped animal. The walls of the corridor were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, and the air was thick with the musty scent of long-abandoned decay. As he moved forward, the whispers started again, more insistent and desperate. The voices seemed to be coming from all around, weaving in and out of his consciousness, filling his mind with incoherent fragments of despair. The corridor twisted and turned, and each corner revealed more decrepit rooms, their doors ajar and creaking with the slightest draft. In one room, O'Neill saw an old rocking chair slowly moving back and forth, its motion accompanied by a faint, mournful creaking. He stepped inside, his flashlight revealing dusty furniture covered in white sheets. But as he shone the light around, he noticed something strange, faint, hand-like smudges on the walls, as if someone had clawed desperately at the surface. Suddenly, the rocking chair stopped moving. The room grew colder, and O'Neill saw his breath fogging in front of him. A figure began to materialize in the center of the room, an old woman dressed in tattered Victorian-era clothing, her eyes hollow and filled with a deep, unending sadness. She did not speak, but her gaze seemed to pierce through O'Neill's very soul. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the apparition was somehow amplifying them. The woman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers coalesced into a chilling phrase, repeated over and over. "Find us, save us, end the torment." O'Neill tried to speak to her, but his words came out as a mere rasp. He approached her, but as he reached out a trembling hand, the figure dissolved into a cloud of shadow and despair. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pulsating with a rhythmic thud that matched his frantic heartbeat. He stumbled out of the room, the whispers now a cacophony in his ears. He followed the corridor, desperate for a way out. The shadows on the walls seemed to reach out, clawing at him, and the floor beneath his feet seemed to sway as if the corridor itself was alive. He reached another door, this one slightly ajar. As he pushed it open, he was met with a chilling sight, a vast, echoing hall, filled with mirrors of various sizes and shapes. Each mirror reflected distorted versions of the hall, creating an infinite maze of glass. The whispers grew even louder, almost deafening. O'Neill stepped inside, the mirrors surrounding him on all sides. As he walked, the reflections seemed to move independently of him, showing disturbing images of himself in various states of terror and agony. The whispers morphed into a single, inhuman growl, resonating through the hall. Panic set in as O'Neill realized he was completely lost in the maze of mirrors. Every direction seemed to lead to more mirrors, and the reflections began to take on a more menacing quality. They seemed to reach out from the glass, their fingers brushing against him, cold and clammy. In a desperate bid for escape, O'Neill threw himself against one of the mirrors, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. But instead of finding freedom, he was sucked into the glass, falling into an endless void of shifting reflections and tormenting whispers. O'Neill's descent through the mirror felt like an eternity. He was falling through a void of shifting shapes and echoes, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Just when he thought he could fall no longer, he landed on a cold, hard surface. The room he found himself in was dimly lit, with a single flickering light bulb casting long shadows across the floor. The walls were lined with old photographs and eerie paintings of distorted, tortured faces. The air was thick with the scent of decay and mold. As O'Neill stood up, he realized he was not alone. The room was filled with figures, their faces obscured by shadows. They moved silently, their eyes glowing with a spectral light. Each figure held a mirror in front of them, reflecting an endless array of tormented souls. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. It was the mirror that had pulled him in, the source of the torment and terror that had plagued him. O'Neill approached it cautiously, his heart pounding. As he gazed into the mirror, he saw a reflection that was not his own. Instead, he saw a young woman, her face twisted in agony, her eyes pleading for help. The scene shifted to show a dark ritual, with hooded figures chanting and performing grotesque rites around an altar. The vision in the mirror began to shift and change, showing scenes of horrific events and unspeakable suffering. O'Neill saw the LaLaurie Mansion's past come alive, the screams of its victims echoing through the ages. The mirror revealed the truth behind the mansion's curse, the dark rituals that had bound the souls of the damned to the place. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, now more insistent than ever. They spoke of betrayal and revenge, of souls trapped in an eternal struggle. The shadows around him began to writhe and twist, forming into shapes of the damned, reaching out with claw-like hands. O'Neill tried to turn away, but the shadows closed in on him, their grip like iron chains. The figures in the room began to move, their mouths opening in silent screams, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. In a final desperate act, O'Neill grabbed a shard of the broken mirror from the floor and slashed at the shadows. The glass cut through them like a knife through smoke, but the shadows reformed almost instantly, their hunger for torment unending. Just as he was about to be overwhelmed by the darkness, a loud crash echoed through the room. The ceiling above him began to crumble, and the light bulb flickered erratically. The mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying in every direction. The shadows writhed and screamed as they were pulled back into the broken mirror, their cries of rage and despair filling the room. The room trembled violently as the mirror shattered, each fragment releasing a shriek that reverberated through O'Neill's bones. The spectral figures and shadows writhed in a frenzied panic, their tortured souls tearing at the fabric of reality. The room, now a chaotic storm of darkness and glass, seemed to collapse in on itself. O'Neill fought to stay on his feet, the ground shaking violently beneath him. The ceiling continued to crumble, chunks of debris falling around him. Amid the chaos, he spotted a large, dark shape emerging from the shadows, a figure that seemed to be the source of all the malevolent energy in the room. It was a massive entity, an amalgamation of shadow and malice, its eyes glowing with an eerie red light. The entity's presence seemed to suffocate the room, making it nearly impossible to breathe. It moved with a fluid grace, despite its monstrous size, and its voice was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to echo from the depths of hell itself. "You should not have come here," it intoned, its voice carrying the weight of centuries of pain and fury. O'Neill, trembling but resolute, tightened his grip on the shard of glass. "I'm here to end this," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of screams and crashing debris. The entity let out a chilling laugh, a sound that sent ice into O'Neill's veins. It advanced toward him, its shadowy form distorting and shifting as if struggling to maintain coherence. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath him felt as if it were dissolving into an abyss. Desperation fueled O'Neill's movements as he darted through the room, dodging falling debris and slashing at the encroaching shadows with the glass shard. Each cut seemed to weaken the dark force, but it was far from defeated. The entity's form writhed and reformed, its screams blending with the echoes of the damned souls trapped within the mansion's walls. In a moment of clarity, O'Neill realized that the mirror was the key. If he could destroy it entirely, perhaps he could sever the connection between the entity and the realm of the living. He sprinted towards the remains of the shattered mirror, which was now embedded in the debris and twisted metal. As he approached the mirror, the entity's dark tendrils lashed out, trying to drag him back into the shadows. O'Neill slashed at the shadows with the glass shard, each cut causing the entity to recoil in fury. With a final desperate effort, he grabbed a large piece of the broken mirror and smashed it against the remaining fragments. A blinding flash of light erupted from the shards, filling the room with a searing brightness that pushed back the darkness. The entity roared in anguish as its form began to disintegrate, the shadows twisting and writhing before finally collapsing into a void of nothingness. The room was engulfed in a violent maelstrom of light and shadow, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. The light faded, leaving O'Neill in a cold, empty room. The oppressive weight of the darkness was gone, and the air felt oddly still and peaceful. O'Neill collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The shattered pieces of the mirror lay scattered around him, reflecting the pale light of dawn filtering through a cracked window. The mansion was silent, save for the distant sound of sirens approaching. He had survived the confrontation, but he knew the battle was far from over. The mansion still held its secrets, and the darkness that had plagued it was only momentarily subdued. As he stood and made his way towards the exit, O'Neill cast one last glance at the shattered mirror, its fragments lying like the remnants of a forgotten nightmare. The sun was rising over New Orleans, casting long shadows over the city. The phantoms of the LaLaurie Mansion had been confronted, but their story was far from over. As O'Neill left the mansion behind, he knew that the darkness was not truly vanquished, but merely waiting for another chance to emerge. With the knowledge that the haunted past of the mansion was now a part of him, O'Neill stepped out into the light of day, prepared to face whatever shadows lay ahead.